Good afternoon. My name is Jessica Dickinson Goodman. This is a re-recording of a webinar that Larissa and I gave back in May for the TechWomen community. Unfortunately, the recording of the original webinar didn't work out, so a couple months later I sat down to make a new one. Unfortunately, we will be missing Larissa's amazing expertise, but the information is still here that we both worked on. Here's a little bit about both of us. Larissa brought a huge amount of diverse background to the development of this presentation. I've done everything from raise money on the internet through a lot of political and social work, as well as being involved with the TechWomen program in a variety of ways, including last year and this year, I've been honored to be the impact coach for Team Palestine. In my experience working in Washington, D.C., in Seattle, and in Silicon Valley for funders and with funders, there are generally 13 sources of money. I'm ranking them in order of the ways in which people tend to think of them, but there's not a particular right order to seek funding. If you are lucky enough to have some of your own, number 13 might be your first go-to. If you are lucky enough to have a sponsor or a country or know a high dollar donor, maybe that's the right direction. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into how to get foundation funding and how that works, because it's a path that is pretty well developed and relies less on existing social networks. But each and every one of these 13 options is a good one. I'm going to take a moment and note the one for events. Sometimes people think that they have to have big, fancy events, but every culture has different ways of raising money as a community. You might have a bake sale where members of the community bake goods. You might sell tickets to a raffle. There's a lot of different kinds of ways of raising a reasonable amount of capital to get done what you need to get done. There are 3 high-level concepts to keep in mind throughout this presentation and as you go out into the world seeking funding for your social justice project. One is establishing what your minimum viable product is. That's a term that VCs and startups use in Silicon Valley. That is, what is the minimum necessary for you to be satisfied that you are making progress towards your goal? So maybe your goal is ending childhood cancer. But that is a huge goal, and there are millions and billions of dollars wrapped up in it. But your minimum viable product might be producing a platform that allows scientists with good ideas but no funding to seek out funders who have a lot of money but no access to the ideas that they have in their heads. The second key concept is volunteer management. Anytime you're building something that is not a for-profit enterprise, and in some cases, even when you are building a for-profit enterprise, you rely on people's goodwill. Every culture has some concept of volunteering, whether it's zakat or it's tithing, whether it's helping out at bake sales or it's showing up to a local organization to help do cleaning. But managing volunteers, caring for them, making sure that they feel like they are getting enough out of the time they are spending volunteering for you for free is a key part of maintaining and scaling your impact when you're doing a social impact project. And the last is mission focus. Know what you want to get out of the work that you're doing, know what the volunteers want to get out of it, and make sure that everyone is aligned around the mission that you're heading towards. 5 quick tips for applications. That might be applications for a fellowship or a grant. That could be applications for a business license. This is the process that works for almost any time you are putting yourself out there and trying to represent yourself with words and paper. Always write your application at least 2 weeks early, because sometimes the internet goes out, sometimes there's a hurricane, sometimes stuff happens in your life and you don't want your professional goals to be harmed as much as possible by protecting them. You can insulate yourself by planning a little bit ahead. Have a friend read it. This is using up some of your social capital, asking your friends and family to look over your stuff for you. But it's a way to make sure you haven't missed something obvious. 3 is always repeat sections across applications. You may apply to 100 foundations before you get the grant that you need to do what you're doing. They will often ask for the same kind of history of your organization, a statement of your values, Sometimes you'll find that 90% of applications are similar to each other. Sometimes you'll find it's closer to 20%. But always save your own copies of everything you write in a way that you can easily copy and paste into new sections. It's expected, and it's a good way to save yourself time. Number 4 gets back to that number of applications piece, but always assume you're going to have to apply several times. There are foundations that will specifically reject people with the purpose of making sure they have the grit to come back, but they don't tell people that. And so people will expect that if they've gotten rejected once, they'll always be rejected. And it's just not the case, which any of you who applied for TechWomen multiple times know. And 5 is find a former successful grant. I've put together a database of over 2,000 other past grants and examples of the projects that they use that there are links to later in this presentation. That is available to anyone in the TechWomen community. If you have friends who have done similar work, ask to look at their grant. Most organizations that are grant giving will give grants to several people in an industry, so it's unlikely that you're going to be directly competing with your friends. And this is a good way, once you've started writing grant applications, you can share them with people coming up after you. We call that lifting as you climb. 3 tips for proofreading, because there are a lot of different cultural expectations about how precise language will be. People who give out grants tend to be at the high end of any given culture's expectations on word accuracy and spelling and grammar. If you're writing in a language that's not your first language, make sure that you get somebody who is in that language who can review it for you and who is most familiar with it. So there's 3 tips that I use whether I'm writing a poetry or a job application. I read it aloud. I read it backwards, so sentence by sentence, starting from the end and working my way backwards, and I keep the logic in my head as I go. And printing it out and just handwriting it up. This may sound old school to all of us geeks out here, but it is really, really helpful to see the words printed out on paper. That's also how grant reviewers may be reviewing your grant, so you want to make sure the formatting prints nicely. 6 tips for crowdfunding. Maybe your idea isn't one that there are foundations out there looking for. Maybe you don't want to go through the foundation process, but you want to see if you can get a little bit of money from a variety of folks in your community. There are formal platforms for this, like Ko-fi or Patreon if you produce content like art or podcasts, Kickstarter if you're developing products, Indiegogo if you have a charity or an idea. You always want to make sure that you understand how the platform gets paid, because then you'll be setting your budget appropriately. I ran a Kickstarter that raised $15,000 in a month, and 20% of that, $3,000, went to Kickstarter. There's other stuff that goes to taxes. Make sure when you're writing your budget and promising what you're going to give back to your funders, you know exactly how much money you're going to be working with, just like in any other business context. If you can, double your timeline for delivery. You want to underpromise and overdeliver. My Kickstarter was a deck of playing cards about the history of women in computer science. I thought it would take me 2 months to get it printed. It ended up being 4. I let people know it was 3, which meant that I was late. So this is a lesson that I'm sharing to you because I did it wrong the first time. When you're doing a crowdfunding campaign, you should set your budget so that you can raise your first 20% in the first 3 days. So if I had a 1-month campaign, and that meant if I wanted to raise $15,000, I needed to raise at least $3,000 in the first 3 days. How do you know if you can do that? You ask your friends. You say, is this something that you're going to be interested in? And then you just try. A lot of times with most of these, something like Kickstarter, they're only going to pay out if you meet your goals. There's other ways to do campaigns where you get paid out even if you don't meet your goals. But sometimes you just have to take a risk and see if it's going to work. But part of taking a risk is making it an informed risk, which is where point 5 comes in. You always have to deeply study all the past successful campaigns you can find in your space. If you are making a game to teach about the history of women in chemistry, or maybe you're putting together a really wonderful new product that would help young people study when there's not electricity available, go and see if somebody else has done something similar. What kind of rewards did they give? How did they market it? How did they make their video? There's nothing wrong with taking inspiration from past campaigns. It's you're expected to do, and it'll help you be successful. And number 6 is crowdfunding through these formal mechanisms requires some kind of tangible benefit. I had my decks of playing cards and posters. I also had thank you notes and videos. I've had folks who crowdfunded to help them make trips, and I donated to one of my friend's campaigns who was trying to come to the United States from Gaza. And when she was visiting, she came to my house and she taught me how to cook a dish, a traditional dish. And it was really lovely. I ended up cooking it for my family's Thanksgiving the next year. But there are a lot of different tangible benefits you can provide if you're doing crowdfunding. Now, not every country uses crowdfunding and not every community is comfortable with it. So your mileage may vary, but if you like this idea, maybe you're the one to start crowdfunding in your country and start it as a trend. 3 reminders. You're asking people to give you money, and you're not going to get a product out of it. So it's not a traditional corporate enterprise interaction. So when you're asking people, whether it's people who work at a foundation or it's people who are going to donate to a couple of dollars to your crowdfunding campaign, or it's a corporation that you're hoping that they'll use corporate social benefits to support you, you're always talking to people. So they're doing that work. They're trying to give away money because they're trying to fill a gap in their hearts or a gap they see in the world. Try and understand what is the gap from their perspective. Even if you disagree with them, try and understand where they're coming from. The second is sometimes people get shy about asking for money. Every culture has different sets of rules about how people interact with money, and every family has their own rules within those cultures. So maybe you can't ask people you know for money because it's not culturally appropriate, but you can tell them that you're trying. They're proud of you and they love you and they want you to do well. So make sure you update them. You don't have to be shy about it, but you may find out that they happen to know about somebody who is giving money away that they wouldn't otherwise. My experience being around the amazing ladies in the TechWomen community the last 7 years is that home countries and home cultures are far, far richer emotionally and in terms of support and occasionally in terms of resources than most people expect. So giving your community the chance to support you is a good thing. And the third one is just a piece of encouragement. Always take the next step. Always, always keep moving forward. You get a no, you send out 2 more applications. You just have to keep grinding. It's the entire process of seeking money for social impact projects rewards persistence. And so be as persistent as possible. Because this is a relatively short presentation and I couldn't go into everything that you might possibly want to know, I've outlined 10 topics that you might want to Google to follow up. These are all websites where you can, or Google searches, that will help you dig into, is crowdfunding available? Is there a community that is already working on this problem? For example, let's say you wanted to work on reproductive health care and you live in Zimbabwe. If you Googled Zimbabwe reproductive health care and you dig into the Google results like page 4 and 5 and 6, maybe you find an organization that is already doing the work that you care about and you can go and be a volunteer with them. This isn't listed specifically here, but I always find if I expect other people to give me their time for free, I should spend a certain amount of my time volunteering, either for them or for projects I care about. It helps keep you humble as a leader to take orders from other people, and it also helps make sure that you are connected to what a good volunteer experience and a good funding experience looks like. So number 6, sometimes I get questions about that one. Sometimes religious communities have a existing pot of money that they are giving out to social projects. Maybe traditionally it's been a food project, but maybe your idea is about helping restaurants with excess food give it to people who are hungry. That could be a good use of a mosque or a church's or a temple's extra money that they're using for that. So just keep your ear open. You can also There are some communities that will let good members of their community use that kind of money even if they're not a member. So even if you're not a member of a particular community, get to know people who are and ask them. here is a key resource that I developed for this presentation and that is available to the entire TechWomen community. It is a spreadsheet, it's a Google spreadsheet that is openly available with more than 2,000 examples of past grants. That's a lot, and it can be overwhelming. So I've organized it in a lot of different ways, specifically by country, though that doesn't mean you can't look at neighboring countries or regional ones. A little bit of history about this because it'll help as context. There is a nonprofit in the United States called the Foundation Center that's headquartered in San Francisco. The Foundation Center aggregates thousands and thousands of grant applications that were successful to help nonprofits be more effective at seeking money. Now, that may seem like a weird mission to help other people get money, but it's what the Foundation Center does. It's their entire purpose, is to help nonprofits get access to foundation funding. Maybe your project doesn't have a nonprofit yet. In the United States, we have a concept called an umbrella corporation, where you can go to an existing nonprofit with your idea and ask them to sponsor you. Many countries have concepts of sponsorship. So you're going to have to be creative. You're going to have to try and think around how you want to solve this problem. But each of these grants are examples of foundations that have given money to a particular program that's described in the spreadsheet in your country. That doesn't mean that that money is necessarily sitting there, because that the organization that got that money probably took it and is using it. But most foundations will give to the same countries over and over again, and will give to the same project spaces over and over again, serving the same communities and with the same issues. So if you see that a particular foundation gave $5,000 to an organization working on autistic girls' access to primary education, then if they gave it in 2014, in all likelihood, if you go to that foundation's website, they're probably going to give it in 2019 as well. That's usually how foundations work and how their funding streams work. So there's not a link that you can click to fill out your information and then get a grant. It's a little bit harder than that to get this kind of money, but they'll have their grant applications on their websites. They'll have deadlines and timelines, and you just have to use your engineering and marketing skills and your project management skills to make it work. So here is what that spreadsheet looks like. As you can see, this is the one for Palestine. And on the left-hand column, you have the grant maker name. That is the foundation or organization. That's everywhere from Tides to Madre to the Ford Foundation. The grant maker state, this is just context to get you a sense of where they are. And maybe when you're looking through this, you realize that there are a couple that are headquartered in San Francisco, and you can look them up and see if they're having a cocktail party while you're available and you're in the States if you're traveling to the United States anytime soon. Recipient name. Now this is the fun part. You would Google the grant maker's name to go to the foundation website and see what their grant requirements are. But then before you write your grant application, go to the recipient's name's website. So go to Zucker or the Union of Agricultural Scientists website and try and get a sense of them. And in your head, try and figure out, why did that foundation give this organization money? Sometimes it matters whether the recipient city is similar to yours, but I included that so that maybe if you're in Gaza or in your Ramallah or you're in Bethlehem, you can just go to the headquarters of that particular organization and meet with them and get a sense of how they get their funding. At least in my experience, it's rare that somebody will turn you down for a 15-minute tea, as long as you're coming from a perspective of wanting to learn from them. Almost everybody likes to give advice in almost every community that I visited. The year authorized is to give you a concept of when the last time that particular grant was given in that particular space, but don't let it deter you. If you see that they haven't given a grant on that particular issue since 2008, go to their website and see if they're still offering it. The grant amount will give you a sense, again, of how much money they're working with. Foundations come to their money from a wide variety of ways, but a lot of times they are the money from a very wealthy person's estate that they passed along to further their goals in the world. And they might have passed along 300 years ago. They might have passed along much more recently than that. And very wealthy people have a variety of amounts of money that they have. So, for example, the Global Green Grants Fund gives out grants regularly of $5,000 each. Maybe that's all the money you need. Maybe you only need $5,000. Or maybe you really need $200,000 from the Ford Foundation. Generally speaking, if it's more money, there's going to be more scrutiny. But as a warning, sometimes grants under $5,000 can be way, way more onerous and way harder to apply for than ones that are 10 or 15. So don't undersell yourself. You can go for some of the larger grants. You can ask for less in them. And it's not a wrong thing to choose to not apply for something because the grant is designed in a really difficult way. Just like when you're applying for a job, how a foundation treats you when you're applying for money is how they'll treat you once they give you money. And if they're driving you up the wall, absolutely, absolutely up the wall with how they're behaving around the money that they're offering to give you, they'll probably drive you up the wall once they've given you the money. You are professional ladies doing this work usually in your free time, and you don't have to waste your time on people who are behaving unreasonably as much as you can avoid it. So if a grant giver is just absolutely not to your taste, move along and apply to a different one. A little bit more about how to use this. When you open up that spreadsheet, it could be overwhelming, it could be exciting, but take a moment and close your eyes and think about what you want to do. Think about what's the picture you want to get to. For me, with my Kickstarter about the history of women in computer science, I wanted to get to a place where I would have pictures of little girls holding up the card of a woman who looked like them and smiling and knowing that they could see themselves as a hardware developer or a software developer or as a cybersecurity expert. That meant a lot to me, and that's the picture that I moved towards. And that gave me a lot of words to search for when I was trying to figure out how to fund it. Girls, education, funding, cybersecurity, hardware, software. All of those terms are ways that you can start searching for grant funding for the work that you're doing. The second thing to do with this database is to look through to see if someone is funding work like the work you want to do. Now I'm going to go back to the previous slide. If you look in column I and column H is the strategic goal that the particular grant maker was focusing on. So it could be program funding or general support. But that will give you a sense of if you're doing a program, if your project idea involves advocacy, look for the ones that include the word advocacy. Then you get to the description, and that's where you really want to dig in deep, because as we were talking about on the next slide, the description will tell you how the nonprofit that received the money used the money. So maybe they created a summit, maybe they created a camp for girls. As you see on line 29, the Mediterranean Women's Fund provided $6,637 for a teen girls camp. So maybe you want to do something similar. You could go to their website, see if they're still offering that kind of grant. So that's where that description will tell you specifically how the money was used, not just the name of the organization and when it went through. All right, so number 3, I've been talking about this obliquely throughout this whole process, but to be specific, generally speaking, funders will fund the same thing and they'll fund multiple projects. So that means if you and your best friend have ideas that are in the same space, you can help each other with your applications. It's unlikely you'll be directly competing with each other. If you end up directly competing with each other and one of you wins and the other doesn't, there's a lot of other grants out there. So you are almost always going to be benefited by helping other women and helping other people in your space, rather than thinking of this as something you have to be secretive about where you're applying for. Then the last one can be the hardest. It kind of depends on how good you are at deadlines. Given that you succeeded in applying for TechWomen, you're probably pretty good at applications and pretty good at deadlines. But grant makers, just like they are most likely to be extreme sticklers when it comes to grammar and spelling, they're really into deadlines. Really, really, really into deadlines. So as you interact with the application process, if you hear that there's a deadline, take it exceptionally seriously. They may not have any option to extend if you miss it for any reason. And that's why, go back to the very first couple of slides, the reminder to get your application done 2 weeks early. 3 more tips for using this research. I like to say that past is prologue, and that's the case a lot of the time. A lot of times grant writing is iterative. You should expect that you're going to apply for a lot more grants than you'll receive. And then the third one is something that I've been saying throughout this presentation and is really important. Share, share, share. When I find a fellowship or a grant or a board position that I think is a good board position with a good agency, but not something that I particularly want to do, I will take 5 minutes, think of an accomplished, wonderful woman that I know who needs that kind of volunteer experience, and I'll send it to her. That helps build networks, that helps build relationships, and it helps make sure that you get to interact professionally more with people that you like. I've helped friends get on boards and get in organizations, mostly so I could hang out with them at board meetings. And then their brilliant ideas get to influence that organization and make it better for all of us. All right, so here is my contact information as well as Larissa's. I'm going to leave this up for a little bit, though of course you can pause on this slide to see it. And if you have any questions, I've helped to review grants. If I start getting a ton, I will stop asking to review grants for other folks. But if you write one and you're not sure if it's totally the way that you want it to be, feel free to drop me a line and I will try and help out. I may end up connecting you with past alumni of the TechWomen program who may be able to review it for cultural context that I don't have. But if what you need is someone to look over the English language pieces, I am always happy to help out with that. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for taking your big, bold, brilliant, amazing ideas out into the world to work on the real problems that you and your community are facing. And let me know how I can help. Thanks so much.